To understand the age gaps in Little Woman, we need to go to the very beginning. The year is 1796. That is when Goethe's novel Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship was published. Wilhelm Meister was Louisa's favorite novel. She used to read it as a child, and she borrowed it from Ralph Waldo Emerson's library. When Louisa turned 18, Emerson gave her a copy of Wilhelm Meister as a birthday gift, so she could study character. In Little Woman, Friedrich gives Jo a copy of Shakespeare's work, so she can study character. Wilhelm Meister is considered to be world's first coming-of-age novel. Little Woman was one of the many novels that was inspired by it. Wilhelm is somewhat a Laurie type of character. He's a young man and he longs to become an actor, but Wilhelm's father wants him to become a businessman. And it's like what Laurie says in the book, quote, "I want to go to Italy, play music and enjoy myself." Wilhelm is having an affair with a passionate actress called Mariana, but Mariana doesn't seem to be very serious about their relationship. The book doesn't mention Mariana's age, but I imagined her to be a couple years older than Wilhelm, because at least at the beginning of the novel, Wilhelm is written to be quite naive, and then he grows as the novel progresses. There's a funny scene where Wilhelm is giving this long monologue about how he made a puppeteer play as a child, and Mariana is pretending to be interested, but she's like half asleep. Then there's another scene which I guess is supposed to be romantic, where he goes to Mariana's house. He wants to sing her a serenade, but she is not at home. Wilhelm kisses the doormat and the doorknob. Sometimes Goethe, in a way, criticizes his characters when they are being overly romantic. It did remind me of the scene in Little Woman where Laurie wanted to compose the opera that would rouse Jo's soul and melt her heart, and when he starts, he could only think of Jo's unflattering features. And that is something that happens to Wilhelm in the end. He remembers Mariana's less flattering features. This was Louisa May Alcott's favorite book that she read as a child. Wilhelm runs away and joins a traveling theater company, and on his journey he saves a young girl called Mignon. Mignon is about 13 at the beginning of the novel. Like Jo, she dresses like a boy. She also has a disability. Nobody knows where she's from. She speaks with an accent, and she has difficulties forming words and expressing herself. Mignon falls in love with Wilhelm. I don't think the book ever mentions Wilhelm's exact age, but I'd say he was in his early 20s when the novel begins. During his, quote, apprenticeship, Wilhelm gets involved in all kinds of drama. There are the love triangles between the actors, and at one point he falls in love with the dangerous countess, and then he gets involved in a secret society. All kinds of crazy things happen to him. Wilhelm is attracted to Mignon. He finds her funny and fascinating, but it is more of a father-daughter type of relationship. She cannot express her emotions to him, and she is quite upset when she sees Wilhelm with other women. Mignon wants to be his lover, but she dies a tragic death before she reaches adulthood. Goethe captured Mignon's passing in a song called Kennst du das Land? Do you know the land? In Little Woman, this song is always reprised in Jo's and Friedrich's encounters. You know how some couples have their own songs? Well, this is Jo's and Friedrich's love song. When Jo sees Friedrich for the first time in New York, he is singing Kennst du das Land, and Jo knows this song because he is a big fan of Goethe. When they reunite in Concord a couple years later, Jo says, "Now we must finish with Mignon's song for Mr. Bear sings that," said Jo. Before the pause grew painful, Mr. Bear cleared his throat with a gratified hum as he stepped into the corner where Jo stood saying, "You will sing with me, we go excellently well together." A pleasing fiction, by the way, for Jo had no more idea of music than a grasshopper, but she would have consented if he had proposed to sing a whole opera and wobbled away peacefully, regardless of the time and tune. It didn't matter much, for Mr. Bear sang like a true German, heartily and well, and Jo soon subsided into a subdued hum that she might listen to the mellow voice that seemed to sing her alone. Note, the land where the citron blooms used to be Professor's favorite line, for das Land meant Germany to him, but now he seemed to dwell with peculiar warmth and melody upon the words. There, oh there, might with thee I, oh my beloved, go. And one listener was so thrilled by the tender invitation that she longed to say she did know the land, and would joyfully depart thither whenever he liked. End quote. And people say that Jo and Fredrik are not romantic. In the end, Wilhelm falls in love with Natalia, who is the Amy archetype of the story. She inspires him to better himself and leave that toxic life of a drifter behind him. Louisa May Alcott was a transcendentalist, and the transcendentalist view on love was that love could help a person to grow or to evolve so that they could better themselves. When two people fell in love, they would create something better together. Louisa was a huge fan of German female poet Bettina von Arnim. Some people say that Bettina was a fraud, a big-time con woman, and others say that she was an early feminist. When Louisa was a teenager, she read Bettina's book called Goethe's Correspondence with a Child, Goethe's Briefeschell mit einem Kinde in German. It is a collection of letters that Bettina wrote to the poet Goethe. Louisa was a teenager when she read this book. She had developed a crush on her next-door neighbor, philosopher Waldo Emerson, who was 29 years older than Louisa. Louisa writes in her journal, quote, I turned myself into Bettina and made Emerson my Goethe. I would leave flowers to his doorstep and sing Mignon's song in bad German underneath his window. Isn't it interesting that Mignon's song pops up again in Jo's and Fredrik's relationship? There's a quote from Louisa where she writes, I am a hero worshipper by nature. Louisa's father, Bronson Alcott, and Emerson were good friends, but Bronson wasn't always the most stable father figure. Emerson supported Louisa's interest in literature and also let her borrow books from his great library. It is not that much big a surprise that Louisa did develop a crush on him. Bettina was a very unusual woman, a very clever woman, and I think Louisa very much self-identified herself to her. Louisa was a huge fan of Sturm und Drang movement, which was a German movement in literature and art that was started by Goethe, and it emphasized the emotional experiences of the individual. This is what Bettina wrote to her brother about herself, and it could apply to Louisa May Alcott as well. It is no use telling me to be calm. To me that conveys sitting with my hands in my lap, looking forward to the bread we are having for supper. My soul is a passionate dancer. She dances to hidden music, which only I can hear. Whatever police the world may prescribe to rule the soul, I refuse to obey them. Bettina, whose actual name was Elisabeth Bretano, was born in Frankfurt in 1785 into a family of Italian merchants. Bettina had a very strange connection with Goethe. In her youth, her mother Maximilian had been Goethe's first lover and muse. Bettina's mother died when she was only 8 years old, and she was sent to a convent, but she considered Goethe as her family's property. During this time, Goethe had established a position in Germany as the national author and poet. Different to Louisa, Bettina has been described to be incredibly beautiful. Bettina was small and delicate with black blossoming curls, porcelain skin, luminous brown eyes, and magnetism beyond conventional beauty. This is a quote from Gundera's Immortality. She was 22, about the same age as Goethe, when he fell for her mother, Maximilian, back in his youthful Frankfurt days. This earlier infatuation with her mother may have led Bettina to imagine that she could be Goethe's daughter. The feeling grew in her. She had some sort of a secret right to the great poet, because in the metaphoric sense, and who should take metaphor seriously if not a poet, she considered herself as his daughter. In any case, she developed what might be called hero worship for the great man. She was a small person and played on being a childlike figure, like that of Mignon in Goethe's Wilhelm Meister novel. End quote. Hello friends, it is Nina from the Little Woman podcast. Just to let you all know that the Little Woman podcast episode transcripts are now available as books. You can find them as paperbacks and ebooks. They are wonderful reading for all the fans of Louisa May Alcott. You can find all the links from the description. And now, back to the show. Bettina wrote him an impressive amount of 52 letters. In Little Woman, Friedrich asked Jo if she could address him as "du," because in the German language there are two ways to say you, du and sie. Du is the informal way to address another person, something you would say with your partner, and sie is the formal way. In Old English, du was translated to tu. Greta Gerwig has famously complained in every interview about how terrible it is that Friedrich forces Jo to call him tu, without doing any sort of research on what the word actually means. I don't know why Gerwig lies so much. In the book, Friedrich very respectfully and quite adorably asks her if she would like to address him with tu instead of you. And Louisa writes, quote, "Jo found tu a lovely syllable." Kundera continues, "In these 52 letters, Bettina addresses him with the familiar tu form. These letters were the basis of the book she published after Goethe's death, Goethe's correspondence with a child. It was not until the 1920s the authenticity of the correspondence was questioned, when the original letters were discovered and published. When I read Goethe's correspondence with a child, it is a very odd book. She writes to Goethe, but it's never about him. She speaks about their shared future, but never asks him what his thoughts are. It is very similar to Laurie's relationship with Jo. When he proposes, he doesn't ask what Jo wants. He says what he wants, and then there is a scene where Laurie is composing an opera, and it is a moment when you get this feeling that he doesn't care who he wants to marry. He imagines himself to be a prince who saves a helpless princess. Neither Jo or Amy are helpless by any means, so he doesn't see either Amy or Jo as the individuals they are. Laurie and Bettina are not in love with anyone. They are in love with the idea of love. But luckily for us readers, and him, Laurie manages to snap out of that. This is what Bettina's brother Clemens writes. Goethe asked what interested her. "Nothing interests me but you," she said. He invited her to make herself at home. She jumped into his lap, threw her arms around his neck, and went to sleep. Clemens reported that for 3 hours Bettina extolled Goethe, chastised him and revitalized him. "Don't forget, Goethe, how it was I who learned to love you," she wrote to him. "It was through his books. I have been jealous of those other women, and sometimes I have felt myself the subject of your poems, and why shouldn't I dream myself into happiness, where the higher reality is there than a dream?" Goethe was a ladies' man and was kind to Bettina at first, but as the time passed, she behaved more like a stalker, and Goethe only occasionally answered her letters. Bettina left her mark on the world's history. She was amused to Beethoven, and according to some sources, she attracted the attention of Napoleon. Her book, Goethe's Correspondence with a Child, became a bestseller. She married another poet, von Arnim, and had 7 children with him, and later on she became very active in German politics. A very interesting lady. She sounds a bit scary. The whole obsession with Goethe doesn't sound very healthy, but Louisa's love for Bettina and Goethe can be seen in her books. Not only in Jo's and Friedrich's relationship, but also in Jo's and Laurie's relationship. Louisa did tell Emerson about her girlhood crush when she was an adult. They were very good friends, but he had no idea. We have talked about Ladislas Wisniewski before in this podcast. I apologize for the possible repetitions. To those of you who are new here, when Louisa May Alcott was in her early 30s, she traveled to Europe for the first time. She worked as a companion to a cranky, invalid woman called Anna Weld, a little bit similar to Jo working for Aunt March, but Anna Weld wasn't that old. When they were staying in Switzerland, one of the hotel guests was a Polish composer called Ladislas Wisniewski, and Louisa called him Laddie, which is very close to the name Laurie. According to Louisa's diary, he had tuberculosis, and Louisa was a nurse, so she took care of him, and she liked his company. Ladislas was 21, and Louisa was 32, so he was about 11 years younger. I read an interview with Louisa's nephew, and he said that even in old age, his aunt was a prankster. She liked to make jokes about people. In her diary, Louisa writes that Laddie was also a prankster, and then they would make fun of the guests at the hotel and would make practical jokes on them. In Little Women, Jo and Laurie are known for that. They like to make pranks on people. I was never a Jo and Laurie shipper, but I do know many who have read Little Women as children and then read it again as adults and moved on from shipping Jo and Laurie to shipping Jo and Fredrik, because Laurie's character doesn't always age well, especially when it comes to pranking. I like Amy and Laurie together, and I think people are aware that girls mature a lot earlier than boys. For some of the pranks that Laurie does in Little Woman, you just have to wonder if they are supposed to be funny, or is it Louisa May Alcott pointing out that he is immature, because the narrator presents the jokes as being harmless. Louisa May Alcott describes herself as a hero worshipper, and for Jo, Laurie is a hero simply because Laurie is a boy. There's a chapter where Laurie sends letters to Meg in his tutor's name, and Meg believes that it is John who is writing to her, and she sends him these very personal, private answers. And when Mommy finds out, she lectures Laurie, and Jo is like, "My poor Laurie," and Meg is crying in her room at the same time. I don't think that was a harmless prank. Jo and Laurie are like 16 when this happens, but when you move on to part 2 of Little Woman, and Jo and Laurie are in their 20s, Jo has grown out from that behavior. She is a lot more interested in writing and education, and there are times when she is avoiding Laurie because Laurie is now giving her attention that she does not want. Laurie is still behaving like a teenager, and he's still pulling out those pranks. That is not in any Little Woman film adaptation or TV adaptation. Laurie does grow out of that because of Amy, but it takes some time. The time in Vevey was unusual for Louisa. Laddie would take her on romantic walks and bring her flowers. He would compose music for her, and he would talk to her about their shared future. Louisa didn't like Anna Weld that much, but then something happened between Laddie and Miss Weld. Laddie is asked to leave the premises, and Louisa has a short story called Anna's Swim, where a rich heiress called Anna says no when a man called Ladislas proposes to them. When Louisa's employment ended, she traveled to Paris and spent a day with Ladislas without a chaperone, and at the time, this was very scandalous. Unmarried woman with a young man. According to Louisa's diary, some kissing happened in the carriage, and I am rephrasing here. It was time for the old woman to turn her home and solitude. I remember reading that and thinking, "Girl, you are only 32 years old. Why do you call yourself an old woman?" There are many occasions in Louisa's diaries where she calls herself an old soul. In Louisa's diaries there are pages ripped off and mysterious words, "couldn't be," written. Honestly, this is what makes Louisa May Alcott studies so interesting. I believe we also see this in Little Woman when Jo says no to Laurie, because they simply just couldn't be. In part 2 of Little Woman, Laurie pretty often tries to make moves on Jo. There's this moment where Jo is like, "Amy's so ridiculous when she's flirting with the young man," and Laurie says, "Maybe you should take lessons from her." Alcott biographer Harriet Risen writes that It is possible that Ladislas Wisniewski was preying on a wealthy woman. Louisa was no way wealthy at this point. This was before Little Woman was written. She was very poor. He was an exceptionally good-looking young man and could gain people's sympathies. We can only imagine what it was like for Louisa to find out that Laddie was flirting with other women at the same time when he was flirting with her. If any of the Polish listeners have Wisniewskis in the family, feel free to contact me if you know anything about this mysterious real-life Laurie. When it comes to Ladislas, I don't think there is enough fact-based information about him and his relationship with Louisa. I think the most likely scenario is that Laddie developed a crush on her because she was nursing him. Florence Nightingale syndrome. Laddie asked her to call him with the nickname Vario, which his mother used to call him. In Little Woman, one of the reasons why Laurie wants to marry Joe is that Joe can take care of him and be a maternal figure for him, someone who tells him what to do in his life. Perhaps he had a crush on Louisa because she took such a mother-like interest in him. And Louisa liked to take care of people. She worked as a nurse in the war and she loved young boys. Joe in Little Woman loves boys so much that she wants to start a whole school for them. Another real-life Laurie was Louisa's dear friend, Alf Whitman, who was also 10 years younger than Louisa. They met through their shared theater hobby. There never was anything romantic between Louisa and Alf, but some of the brother-sister moments between Joe and Laurie in the novel come from Alf Whitman, especially the theater sequences. Because of this relationship between Wisniewski and Louisa, I don't believe any public statements that Louisa has made in any interview, because there are times when she outright lies to the press. She was often asked who was the real-life Laurie, and then she would say, "It was this nice young man I met in Europe." Then in the letters between Louisa and her sister May, they call him boring, and at some point they had both given him money. Laddie never paid it back. Louisa did keep in touch with Ladislas. It seems that at some point he returned to Poland and started a family, but I haven't been able to find anything else about his movements. Why did Greta Gerwig say that Laurie wants Joe to step into adulthood, when in the book Joe is so tired of Laurie because he's so immature? Louisa lived during a time when modern celebrity worship culture was starting to take shape. She never liked Little Woman that much, and I think I know why. Every day Louisa would get tons of mail from children and adults all over the world which all said, "Please marry Joe to Laurie." And Laurie was based on her ex. But the world would never know that because the money that she received from Little Woman supported her entire extended family. Just like today, the yellow press wanted to know everything about celebrities' love life. If they had found out that Louisa had a fling with a man so much younger and a foreigner, she could have lost her publishing deals and her entire reputation. Ryzen also points out the possibility that she paid him money to shut him down. Louisa always got Laddie as my boy, same way as Joe calls Laurie as my boy in Little Woman. I don't know if Louisa had romantic feelings for him at some point, but he turned out to be a disappointment. And at the same time, it also sounds very much like a mother and son relationship. Louisa has a quote that marriage requires a lot more than just physical looks. It requires an emotional and intellectual connection. Here is some interesting trivia. Louisa's sister Anna, she married Mr. John Pratt. Anna was 33 years old and John was 31. In the 19th century, most women married when they were young, and a lot of people married for money. It was encouraged, not looked down upon. Anna clearly took her time to find a suitable person for herself and married for love, and she was a couple of years older than her husband. That is a very small age difference. In Little Woman, Meg March, who is based on Anna Alcott, meets John Brooke when she is 17. They fall in love, and the book is quite vague about John's age, but he's written to be quite a bit older. I always thought he was maybe 8-9 years older than she. So when they marry, Meg is 21 and John is 29. You bet your life there are people who say that he was grooming her. Little Woman was not written by a man but a woman who had a serious thing for age gaps. Amy and Laurie also have an age gap. In the novel, Laurie is 4 years older than Amy. That is not a huge age difference, especially the moment when Amy lectures Laurie. She's emotionally a lot more mature than he is. Story-wise, I think they help each other to grow. That's beautiful. I'm still waiting an adaptation which shows that. When living in Europe studying art, Louisa's little sister, May, fell in love to a young man called Ernest Nieriker. When they married, May was 38 and he was 22. She was 16 years older than Ernest. Both Louisa's sisters married men who were younger than them, but in Little Woman, Jo and her sisters marry men who are older. Let's go back for a moment to Louisa's fascination with Bettina von Arnim. I would actually highly recommend everyone to read that book. It is in the public domain. When Bettina wrote it, she wasn't a child. She was in her 30s when she wrote it. It is based on these letters that she really did write when she was in her 20s, whose first crush was Walter Emerson, and he was 29 years older than Louisa. Then there was the ambivalent relationship with Ladislas, who was 11 years younger. You know what's coming. Henry David Thoreau was 16 years older than Louisa. In Little Woman, Jo's and Frederick's age difference is 16 years. Henry is Frederick in Little Woman. He's Mac in Eight Cousins and Rose in Bloom. He's the priest in Long Fatal Love Chase. David in Work. He's Adam in Moods. He's Augustus in Queen of Hearts, and probably quite a few other characters in Louisa May Alcott's books. And he is pretty much always the love interest. When Jo travels to New York, she is 23 and he's 39. I can see why somebody in the 19th century would call Frederick old because people's life expectancy was much lower. But come on, if somebody calls Frederick old now, they need to have their head checked. Jo is a little older when they marry. In the 19th century, the age gap marriages were very common because young women were expected to marry older men because that way their future was financially secured. I don't know how it was in America, but for example, in England, women would only inherit a small sum of their father's money, and the rest would go to their closest male relative. Around the time when she was 18 or 19, she fell in love with him, and that seemed to have lasted her entire life. Henry passed away at 44. He died of tuberculosis. Louisa was 28 at the time. Emerson kept a speech in the funeral, and Louisa got mad about it and said that it was mean-spirited and critical. She didn't like it when people judged Henry, and in her memorial poem, Louisa calls him as the perfect man. Then in many of her books, Louisa marries her alter egos to men like Henry and men who are based on him. There's also a quote from Louisa where she calls Emerson as her Goethe and Henry as her Napoleon. And when it comes to the age gaps in Little Woman, I cannot but help thinking about the moment in Under the Umbrella when Jo says to Frederick, "Don't call yourself old. 40 is the prime of life. I would love you even if you were 70. Thank you so much for listening. Take care and make good choices. Bye.